why do women, and sometimes men, send money to scammers on online dating, or as I call it, online duping? It's also known in forensic circles as romance fraud. So we might look at the lady that has given all her life savings over to some scammer in emails and texts, and always contacts where you never see the person's face, so no live video calls. And we might think, well, that woman must be, really unintelligent. But the truth is they're not unintelligent, but they are something else. So there's two things that have happened to this person who becomes a target, an easy target. The first thing that has happened is that they've suffered a loss in their past, and that loss has been the loss of somebody they loved. And the second thing that's happened is that loss has not been repaired. So they have an undercurrent, an emotional vacancy of loneliness. And when we look at case studies of people who've sent horrendous amounts of money to scammers, who we might look and say, well, that was clearly he was a scammer. What were they thinking? Well, they weren't thinking, they were feeling. And the truth is about our reality is, when it gets too painful, we opt out of reality and disappear into fantasy. And the thing is about fantasy is everything works out, doesn't it? So in fantasy, we are left to imagine what that relationship is going to look like when they eventually meet up with us. And we are victims to our fantasy imagination in these sorts of scenarios. And why it's such a powerful mind dynamic is that it's a defense mechanism, actually. So we act sometimes against the truth of the situation by masking it with the opposite to the truth. And then we invest in upholding the fantasy, the defense mechanism, to preserve the fantasy that we are loved. So even though they don't physically live with their person that they think is going to marry them, in their mind they do. So these relationships are no different from if you were seeing somebody every day of the week. They are getting messages from them every day of the week, so the fantasy is being fed every single day. Loneliness is a very powerful motivator of some erratic and often not great behaviour. We often, in the throes of loneliness, don't make the best decisions because it's painful. And who wants to live in reality and the the painfulness of loneliness when we can live in fantasy and the happiness? And then there's something that's rarely mentioned, if ever, actually, I've not seen it in any text. It's the dopamine effect, that when you get a hit, approval from your love object, it releases a chemical in your brain that makes you feel better. And so you have, you're fighting then not just reality, you're fighting your own chemistry. And so there's a lot more to it. We must not judge when we find out that somebody has been the victim of online scamming through dating, because what's happened there is there's been a fundamental loss to that person's mentality and a chemical release that has compensated it. So even when you show some people the truth, that person doesn't really exist, it's spectacular, it's very painful to watch. When you show somebody the reality, this is the photograph of the person you thought you were receiving love from and sending money to, but actually this is the person. Sometimes, or mostly, they're not even the nationality that is being described or pretended. Sometimes they're not even the gender. I won't go into catfish, some of you know the programme. But it can be devastating. But here's the problem. That doesn't break the fantasy. So we might be thinking, well, for goodness sake, we've just now given you evidence that you're being ripped off, that you're being duped, and you're still going to send them money? Well, let me make everybody feel better. I know of a case of a solicitor, so a very intelligent lady, who fell victim to this. And she even confessed publicly that if he called her, this is after he was arrested and put in prison, if he called her and asked for money, she'd probably still give it to him. And the reason I'm sharing that with everybody is because so you don't feel that somehow there's a deficiency in your psychology. What there is a vacancy in your heart. And for anybody that's trying to help anybody else out, if you've got a family member that's being seduced in such this intoxicating way, then I would suggest that trying to break fantasy with reality may or probably will not work. But what you should address is the loneliness, the fundamental feeling of loss that is underpinning the truth about why that person doesn't want to live in reality, that they want to live in fantasy. And I think this brings us all the way back to what is love really, because love is community. And if you know that somebody is living on their own, that they're in a position of loss, that they might be emotionally vulnerable, then it's best to invite that person for a chat and with friends rather than leave them victim to their own fantasy. And the reality is that they could easily be duped. The best defence against this sort of setup is not to try and put reality into the fantasy, but to actually bring love into their reality so that you can bring them back into life, back into community, back into feeling that they have support. And that really is the antidote. So they've lived in fantasy because that's the only place they think they can get love now. But if you want to help your family member or a friend, then you have to bring more love into their reality and bring them back into life. Bring them back to love.